Welcome everyone. I'm Nikolai Minchev. I'm a principal research fellow here at IGP. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first director seminar of the new year. The theme for this term's series, as you know, is Political Turning Points 2024-2025, Causes, Consequences, and Solutions. We're very delighted to welcome today's speaker, Professor Will Davies. Professor Davies is a professor of political economy at Goldsmiths. He's author of numerous books, including The Limits of Neoliberalism and Nervous States, and writes regularly for the London Review of Books and The Guardian. And you can read more of his work at williamdavies.blog. And today he will be talking about post-neoliberalism, paradigm shift or vibe shift. So, Will, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the IGP. And we look forward to learning more about post-neoliberalism. Thank you.
I was delighted to receive this invite a few months ago to come and speak at one of these seminars with the theme of political turning points. I think there was also some reference to uncertainty somewhere in the blurb. Maybe I took aspects of the invitation a little literally, but I wanted to use this as an opportunity to reflect on the nature of turning points and the nature of uncertainty by going back to some previous work, but also some key ideas in political economy, particularly in what's called ideational political economy, which emphasizes the role of ideas, intellectuals, experts in political turning points. And I guess to also ask some awkward questions, particularly about the present moment, the present conjuncture. So I don't have a conventional academic paper here today. I don't know whether you'll be pleased or relieved or not to hear that. But what I want to try and do is to probe aspects of the seminar series theme in relation to the present moment of deep anxiety about the state of the world. And of course, it's very difficult not to be thinking about events in the United States over the last few days or even minutes. It seems to constantly unfold in unpredictable and often quite frightening ways. I'm going to be also outlining some debates that took place within political economy and economic sociology regarding how does neoliberalism end, what comes after neoliberalism, and how would we know what counted as post-neoliberalism. And there are lots of different perspectives on that question from within political economy and historians of economics. There are those who have been arguing for a while that neoliberalism as we know it has been dead for some time. There are others, in particular, those who know the work of the historian of economics, Philip Borowski, who argues very forcefully that no, what you're seeing when you see entrepreneurs lining up at the inauguration in front of the rest of the cabinet members is the most naked manifestation of neoliberalism there is. And then there are others who try to understand this moment through some kind of existential ambivalence, that could we be talking about something that is dead but still walking amongst us, or has some sort of half alive, half dead quality, or has some kind of mutant quality. I think perhaps most plausibly one way of understanding elements of the present is as logics of liberalism and logics of neoliberalism and some of the rhetoric of it being radicalized and turned upon itself in various ways. So just to start, as Nikolai mentioned, I published a book some years ago, this is now about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, The Limits of Neoliberalism. I'm just not going to dwell on this, but there are those, I'm assuming, I should say, that we come from a range of disciplines. It's a pleasure to be speaking without immediately having a very clear sense of exactly which discipline anyone is working within, but I'm going to assume that people have some overlapping interests, but not necessarily some kind of doctrinal assumption, a set of presuppositions about methods and theories and so on. So I want to also lay out some groundwork in case it's helpful. But what do we mean by neoliberalism? It's important just to be clear. So I've just sketched out a definition here. We're talking about an intellectual and political project whereby the state is deployed to eradicate impediments to market competition. So you could talk about policies of privatization, expand the reach of the market. So you could look at policies that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, of what's been called the Washington Consensus, in which conditions are attached to loans which require markets to be opened up for anti-labour laws to be introduced, for various forms of privatisation to be enacted. Also, one might think of something like the European Union as being a manifestation of this, in the sense that some of the central tenets of European law, in fact the founding of them back to the 1950s, concern the legal protection of competition and prevention of things like state aid and this sort of thing. And of course that is a very clear example of how the defence of the market goes hand in hand with the institutionalisation of market logics within law and treaties and so on. And also the reform of non-market institutions and around ideals, techniques and behaviours identified with markets and enterprise. And I think anyone who works in the university probably doesn't need to hear too much more about that. But one could look at the policies known as the Third Way of the 1990s of Blair and Clinton and others as examples of that, where institutions within education, the arts, aspects of the welfare state are not privatised, they're not turned over to the market, but they are governed in ways that tries to release certain behaviours, certain moral propensities and so on, which are associated with enterprise and entrepreneurship and so on. I think one thing, I'm not going to dwell on this, is a very expansive historical set of claims here, but one thing which I think is interesting is also to think a bit about the different rhetorics of liberty as they have changed over time. If we think of different manifestations and traditions of liberalism and neoliberalism dating back 400 years almost, you could look at liberalism always as an argument against what are perceived to be forms of arbitrary political power and seen to be checks upon individual freedom. And so the character of any manifestation of liberalism or neoliberalism or whatever the kind of liberalism we might be living with or seeing emerge now is defined partly by who its enemy is, by who it is trying to convince or who it is trying to attack as being somehow the enemy of freedom, the enemy of liberty, and so on. And in terms of this very sweeping historical characterization or genealogy, I think one of the significant questions in scholarship on neoliberalism and post-neoliberalism in recent years is where does this set of rhetorics, this set of arguments for individualism, for liberalism or liberty go in the wake of the collapse of state socialism, the collapse of alternatives to capitalism, or at least as perceived in the 1990s. And there's a lot of quite interesting work, the more recent work by people like Quinn Slobodian, the historian in the United States, in his recent book, Crack Up Capitalism, but also his forthcoming one, which is called Hayek's Bastards, about what happened to some traditions of neoliberalism after the 1990s when the conventional objects of critique and rhetorical persuasion and animosity were no longer present in this age when it seemed that there was no alternative to neoliberal capitalism. And even if you read a book like Anthony Giddens' Third Way, right back in the late 90s, there's a sort of sense of disorientation in that book, as much as it's seen as a kind of celebration of something, a celebration of a certain model of capitalism. There's also a strong sense of disorientation and slight unease regarding how do you pursue a model of liberalism in the absence of a clear competitor. This is a series of scholarly debates that I think is I'm just sort of flagging up here, which has been this discussion about what is post-neoliberalism, when does it arise, how do we know it, what are the key manifestations of it, has been developing particularly since 2008 with the global financial crisis. And these are just some manifestations of how this debate has manifested itself. I edited with Nick Gain at Warwick a special issue of Theory of Class and Society on some of this a few years ago. But broadly speaking, I think what you see here is two sets of diagnoses going on. You see those which are broadly a response to the global financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9, running up to sort of 2010, 2015 by people like Jamie Peck and others. And then you see a rather different set of responses to the democratic upheavals of 2016 in the Anglosphere. Obviously, the sort of cliche of Brexit Trump. I say cliche because it's sort of often seen as this rupture of sometimes sort of world historic significance when obviously it was within particular political locales. But this did prompt this renewed question of, are we still looking at the same what do we call this thing that's come along that seems to be breaking from the orthodoxies of previous years? So you could see sort of two different strands for this. On the one hand, there's a sort of crisis of economic liberalism that breaks out in Wall Street in 2007, 8, 9, and then you get this crisis of political liberalism that follows sort of 8 years later and generates a slightly different set of diagnoses. Broadly speaking, these tend to draw on a mixture of Foucault's lectures on neoliberalism, which were published in English only in 2008, which is partly spawned a huge amount of follow-on literature, including some of the work by Wendy Brown and others. But also there's this Poulantzas, the work that draws particularly on Poulantzas by people like Ian Brough and others, to think a bit about what does this authoritarian turn in capitalism mean and how does it relate to the wider crises of capitalism. Now, one of the interesting things about the more recent few years, if you're interested in the history of ideas, is how there's been this turn towards what I call here reflexive post-neoliberalism, which is that the very question of what comes next has been picked up not by scholars at all, but by particular elite actors. So you can probably recognise the Financial Times font in the top left, talking about the post-neoliberal world. This is, I think, the Atlantic, the New York Times, and this question of the death of neoliberalism shifts from the academy into the op-ed pages. It becomes something that is debated amongst policymakers, policy elites, and so on. And this is sort of, for those of you who've been working on this question in the years beforehand, there was something rather kind of surreal about this moment, because for quite a long time there was a certain kind of technocratic distaste for talking about isms and neoliberalism and so on. It was particularly in the context of the Sanders campaigns of 2016 and 2020, the Corbyn leadership of 2015 onwards. There was this slight sense, we mustn't talk in these grand ideological terms because that's something which the radical left wants to do, and it can't be something that the liberal centre should engage in. But I think one of the reasons why this happened was that the Trump presidency came to be viewed as this kind of rupture that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was the crisis that required fresh reflection about the future directions, particularly in the United States, together with the COVID pandemic, the lockdowns of 2020 and 2021. So that the combination of the Trump presidency and its end, and that the pandemic provoked this moment where it was okay to start talking in these kinds of grand ideological terms. And there was, as you may know, Biden famously early on in his presidency held seminars with historians to talk about the sort of grand turning of wheels in these kind of paradigmatic historic terms. And so I think it's quite interesting to think a bit about how do ideas move in that way. We also saw over the course of the Biden presidency a whole new set of the search for grand ideas that went on and was pronounced by the likes of Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary Jake Sullivan, the Defence Strategic Advisor, and then Rachel Reeves, the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, picked up some of these ideas of what Yellen called modern supply-side economics, Danny Roderick called new productivism, Bidenomics obviously became the wider umbrella term for this. And then Rachel Reeves gave a speech in Washington, D.C. in March 2023 about the idea of what she called securonomics, which was in some ways trying to sort of come up with her own stamp on some of this. And as many critics have since argued, it did gradually descend, or it gradually mutated much of this into a national security agenda as it became more preoccupied with the onshoring of production, of trade wars with China, and really building on some of the Trump trade policies. The other thing, which I think, again, this is sort of, I'm sure there are many of us who have followed some of these sorts of initiatives, but you look at something like the Hewlett Foundation. This 2022, when it was first announced, $40 million made available to explore alternatives to the neoliberal model of capitalism distributed around various academic centres in the United States. This was on top of things like, I'm sure many of you are familiar with INET, the Institute for New Economic Thinking, funded heavily by or maybe entirely by the Open Society Institute. I believe that was something like $150 million looking for alternative economic ideas. But so there was you saw signs of large philanthropic capital being mobilised around this search for a kind of paradigm shift. The other thing which I think is interesting when thinking a bit about what kind of paradigm shift might or might not have been underway was some of the intellectual consequences of the pandemic, or the things that coincided with the pandemic, where there was, Davos is underway right now, but the Davos of 2021, the pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. Now that, unfortunately, is now the focus of an entire conspiracy theory regarding this notion of the Great Reset that Davos elites were allegedly engaged in trying to establish. But you also saw, here again, the Financial Times seeing this as being the moment when there could be this kind of paradigmatic shift in the nature of capitalism away from neoliberalism. Now, the title of my talk today slightly flippantly refers to vibe shifts, which was a term that also came along around about the same time as some of these ideas of this. This was in the realm of trend spotting. This was a famous article that went kind of viral around about this time, talking about was there going to be some kind of vibe shift in things like fashion and ethics and lifestyles and so on. And this was a sort of, again, looks rather sort of silly now, sort of talking about the rise of a kind of a more, what was argued to be a slightly more, maybe not reactionary, but a turn away from certain kinds of social liberal values that was underway. And this was in the pages of various kind of trend spotting and, well, in that case, op-ed pages. Now, I'm going to, in a bit, try and give a little bit of sort of epistemological credibility to maybe not this as such, but to try to think a bit about what these sorts of articles were grappling towards offer a different understanding of political and economic and social change than the rather grander ideological sense of paradigmatic shifts and new isms that these elites of Davos, in Washington, D.C. and London, the pages of the FT and so on were dealing with. And of course, now we have this, as I'm sure I don't need to remind anybody right now. And this, I think, throws huge questions as to what did all of that discussion of paradigm shifts, of what comes after neoliberalism, what is the new social contract, how will we develop a new, more humane, more inclusive capitalism? I mean, it's something which has been sort of hugely demoralising for, I mean, it's only sort of day 4, I'll say, for people involved in some of those sorts of discussions. And I think it raises some, quite big questions about how to understand what were considered to be some of the major ruptures of this time, and what was the rupture and what was the new norm, and vice versa. There's also been these sorts of discussions going on, again, that there might have been some major normative shift that is underway in the nature of capitalism. So, what I want to do to sort of reflect on this a little bit, and is the following. First of all, I want to think a bit about why we assume that regimes of political economy, regimes of regulation and economic policy making move in this kind of paradigmatic way by one ideology kind of replacing another ideology. And look a bit at the role of intellectuals, ideas, some of the kind of key assumptions of the ideational political economy that I referred to earlier. I then want to, I guess, just try and identify some of the reasons why that understanding of political economic change don't seem to be capturing the reality that we've seen in recent years, and also some of the ways in which it misleads us. I think it's interesting, fact that there has been this rather explicit elite-led turn towards paradigmatic thinking in recent years, and I think we need to think a bit about why that is and what that signifies. We have this kind of rather familiar chronological assumption about uncertainty and political change that I guess is probably best captured in this very well-known quote by Gramsci, that the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born, and now is the time of monsters, which is the notion of a crisis as an interruption which generates uncertainty, and that uncertainty is resolved by some kind of decision, by some kind of turning point, and then some kind of new path. And the idea of crisis as a feature of capitalism is utterly fundamental to so many key theories of political economy, probably most famously Marx's. But that chronology of stability being interrupted by crisis is something that I think shapes so much of our understanding of social, political, economic change. And it also has implications for the role that we attribute to ideas, ideologies, and isms in the management of those things. The concept of paradigm shifts, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is something that derives from the history of science and philosophy of science of Thomas Kuhn in his 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And that book, I mean, there's huge amounts to say about that book, but it's got its entire vocabulary of its understanding of historical development and the development of scientific knowledge. But it's got this, partly within that vocabulary, it has the notion that most of the time what scientists are doing, and this is talking about natural sciences, not about the social sciences or economics, is something that he calls normal science, which is generally filling in the gaps of a theory, and the theory remains broadly static, and empirical investigation fills in the gaps. And this suggests that actually most of what science does, it's rather sort of unwelcome observation for many scientists. Much of the time what scientists do is relatively conservative, because actually what they're doing is working not to move things forward radically, but actually to prop up a certain set of assumptions about the world until they come up against some kind of anomaly, something that doesn't fit in to a theory or a paradigm, and this eventually, over quite a long period of time, leads to a revolution, but it takes a considerable amount of time. Again, much of this is probably familiar to many of you, but I think it's worth thinking a bit about what we mean by uncertainty, and I thought it would be worth sort of bringing this here, partly because of the emphasis on thinking about uncertainty in this seminar series. The ideas of Frank Knight, the Chicago economist from the first half of the 20th century, in his book Risk, Uncertainty and Profit, he distinguishes between two different concepts of uncertainty. One that is uncertainty that can be converted into risk through forms of calculation, that is, it is uncertainty that is amenable to some kind of mathematical modelling, and a number can be put on the probability of a certain event happening. And this is what we could call normal uncertainty. And capitalism always involves forms of normal uncertainty. Capitalism is a system which involves people taking bets on the future through forms of investment, speculation, equity investment, entrepreneurial business plans, and so on. And then there is what is often called Knightian uncertainty, because what Frank Knight is famous for pointing out is that there remain forms of existential uncertainty alive within society, any society, where the genuinely unexpected, the genuinely unpredictable, the genuinely unpredicted, and the unmodelable can come along. And you can look at what's the discussions of the insurance sector in relation to California at the moment as an example of the struggle for certain forms of, I guess, Knightian uncertainty, although some people say it wasn't entirely unpredictable, that eventually something of that scale would happen. But the Knightian uncertainty involves some kind of incalculable novelty or threat. But I think it's also, this is not from Knight, but it's also worth thinking a bit about political uncertainty, which is the uncertainty that is kind of deliberate in the sense that it involves political actors who have particular plans, ambitions, strategies, and so on. And if you want to think about what is confronting US capitalism at the moment, and in fact the global economy, it is as much as anything else political uncertainty around, does Trump mean what he says? Will Trump do what he said he was going to do? What will he do next? And I think that probably belongs in its own category, that can't simply be sort of thrown into Knightian uncertainty, which is a kind of ontological state of being, whereas there is political uncertainty that is almost deliberate. I mean, Trump would be an example of it emanating from a sort of, well, a narcissistic leader, whereas, of course, you could also, the greater fear for the neoliberals in the early 20th century was that it would emanate from the people, from the masses, from democracy, from socialists, and so on. The second of these forms of Knightian uncertainty is what entrepreneurs and financial disruptors hope to exploit. But in a way, it's the third of these that liberalism and neoliberalism have always been seeking to prevent in various ways. The concept of economic paradigm shifts, I mean, there's a kind of, within the literature on this, and I'm drawing particularly on Mark Blythe's work in his books, things like Great Transformations and so on. There is particular, basically crises come along, they elevate normal uncertainty escalates into chronic Knightian uncertainty. So the models and the theories and the forms of knowledge that were used in order to understand and govern and regulate a model of capitalism no longer work. And when they no longer work, you get this crisis, and there needs to be a new set of ideas, and there need to be new intellectuals that need to be mobilized in order to reduce uncertainty and make it predictable and modelable and calculable all over again. And ideas have these various functions for Blythe in this reduction, this renormalization or stabilization of uncertainty. They reduce uncertainty by explaining what's going on. They allow for particular collective and political actions in response. They can also be used by those people who want to push for a new model of capitalism, a new policy regime, and they also offer these new blueprints for different policies, institutions, and so on. And that once the crisis passes, it's the ideas that create new, or they provide the blueprints for new sorts of institutions and a new form of stability, a new form of kind of normal policy making resumes. And the other, some of the work that on this that I think is also quite significant here by Peter Hall in particular in his analysis of the UK in the 1970s and 1980s, he talks about what does it take for a particular idea to emerge triumphant from a crisis, and he talks about the need for ideas to solve economic problems. They need to be able to explain anomalies that have come along, so that when the old set of ideas is unable to explain the anomaly, the new set is able to. They need to fit with the administrative capacities of government. It's no good saying the way to fix this particular economic crisis would be to do this thing, but you don't have the ability to do it, that you don't have the policy armoury for it. And there also needs to be, it needs to fit with a particular coalition of interests that will support that new policy. So I'm not going to sort of dwell on all of the details of this, but what you could call the model case, and I'll come back to that, for thinking about paradigm shifts. And I think what I want to argue is that this has become this dominates our imagination when thinking about shifts in ideology and paradigms, is the transition from Keynesianism of the post-war era into the neoliberalism, Thatcherism and Reaganism and so on of the 1980s. Now, most significantly about this shift, the central goals of policy changed. The goal that had been to pursue full employment over the post-war period was replaced with a more important goal, which was to bring down inflation. Now that's it was a pretty major aspect of the paradigm shift. But this wasn't simply a question of saying, instead of pursuing this policy, we should pursue that policy. But instead, there's an entire understanding of the economy and the government's role within the economy undergoes a profound change, a profound alteration in the very understanding of the economic reality that is being faced. And this is why this notion, drawing from Kuhn about scientific revolutions, is so applicable to this particular case of a paradigm shift, because if you look back at what Kuhn was arguing about scientific revolutions, is that the shift from before and after is not simply about sort of technical minutiae. It's actually before and after people are looking at quite different forms of reality itself. That he says at one point, after a revolution, scientists are looking at a different world. So there's a kind of sense of almost, I suppose, a sort of relativism that is significant there. I think the other interesting things when thinking about, one of the things that Kuhn points out about scientific revolutions is that often it requires this generational transition, so that a certain generation of scientists in that case, but a certain memory that is alive within a generation of scholars and scientists, once it has died out, then different things become possible. So one of the crucial things in the landmark paradigm shift of the 1970s and 1980s was that the memory of the Great Depression in particular, so the memory of mass unemployment and the way in which it led to ultimately to war, was no longer alive in the minds of the policymakers and the elites that were making policies by the 1980s. Now, this paradigm shift had a very clear sense of what the anomaly was, so what was the data point that could not be explained by the dominant ideology, the dominant theory. And the clear anomaly, as it's often referred to, was stagflation. According to Keynesian theory, it was not possible for, or which shouldn't be the case, that you suffered high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. And the rise of what became called stagflation in the 1970s was the clear anomaly that led to the breakdown of one paradigm and the search for a different one in the way that people like Blythe and Hall describe. There was this very famous speech given by Jim Callaghan in 1976, the British Prime Minister, where he used this line that I think has now become the title of, there's an entire book, I think, called this. I tell you in all candor that that option no longer exists. This confrontation that reality had changed, that the old paradigm was no longer available, and that a new set of ideas and a new set of policies needed to be brought in. The thing which I think a lot of the work on the development of neoliberalism has really emphasised is the role that intellectuals played in enabling that shift in the common sense, shift in the paradigm to take place. And the photo there at the top left is the Mont Pelerin Society, the intellectual network that's been widely written about by various historians of economics, which Friedrich Hayek convened, bringing together various philosophers, lawyers, economists, and so on from the 1940s onwards. There was a particularly important role for think tanks in this shift in the UK, particularly the Centre for Policy Studies, but in the United States, these institutions like the Heritage Foundation that played an important role. One of the things that has been pointed out about the UK case in particular was the significance of newspapers. The Financial Times in particular was a place in which ideas that were circulating in American universities, in particular the University of Chicago, got to get a hearing in the pages of the Financial Times by journalists like Sam Britton and others. And there was, Milton Friedman was a famous public intellectual, as well as being a highly revered economist at the University of Chicago, with his own TV series that was quite popular in the United States. So one of the, I suppose, it's almost been a kind of preoccupation of a lot of the studies of the history and the development of neoliberalism in various books, has been to try to understand where did these ideas come from, how did they find their way into the public sphere, how did they travel from particular intellectual outposts, and then how did they go from being a kind of heterodoxy to becoming an orthodoxy, which is really I suppose the question of partly of how scientific revolutions take place. And then you get this turn, the sort of high point of neoliberalism of the 1990s, as I was talking about earlier, where you get the problem of there not being the opponents of a particular regime of liberalism. I suppose if you wanted to characterize how the orthodoxy was now expected to work in the language of Frank Knight, the utopia of neoliberalism, as it was imagined by the 1990s, was that uncertainty would now be processed by the international market system, and that this could last indefinitely as long as politics didn't intrude in any way. So that politics became seen as being the last disruptor, the last possible disruptor of a financial cybernetic system of information processing that otherwise could process all forms of uncertainty. This is the kind of utopian visions of, you see it in the work of the claims of end of history and so on of the 1990s. Now, that's a sort of potted history of how we think about paradigm shifts and the role of ideas and the role of intellectuals in making sense of political, economic and social change. One of the things I think, there's a very interesting book by the sociologist Monica Krause on the idea of model cases, which suggests that one of the things that, this is talking particularly about sociology, is that sociologists have tended to allow particular iconic empirical cases to shape their wider theories about particular objects of study. So when you're thinking a bit about professions, there's a particular resort to thinking about medicine. There's a particularly significance of Chicago in the history of urban sociology as a field of study. And I think that in a way the 1970s has that particular kind of iconic status when thinking about ideological shifts and shifts in policy making. I think that one of the features of the 1970s that I think goes unremarked about, or the feature of the rise of neoliberalism, is that it still accorded huge influence to economists who could come up with things that, back in the language of Peter Hall, were economically viable, technically viable, and politically viable, that the kind of technocratic machine of Keynesianism would be repurposed in ways that still left it as a kind of a technocratic machine, that it still gave a particular significance to figures, well, particularly Milton Friedman, for a reconceptualization, in particular, of macroeconomics in the work of Friedman. I think one of the things that we also have to sort of think a bit about is how is there an exaggerated role that this particular case gives to academics, to intellectuals, to op-ed writers, to think tanks, and so on? Is there, I mean, maybe narcissism is putting it unkindly, but there is one of the things I think that you see in that, what I called earlier, reflexive post-neoliberalism that kind of coincided broadly with the pandemic and the Biden administration, is this notion that if we can get kind of the right ideas or the new ideas and so on, that other things will flow from it. So there's a kind of, I guess, in philosophical terms, a kind of Platonism going on, that you can get these, that the things will flow downwards from ideas, and that way things will, the future will be shaped by that. I think that, what was I going to say about that? I had something else I was going to say about that. Anyway, and then I suppose finally there's this sort of, again, the hold that notions of paradigm shift have on us, that I think that what you saw in that turn towards the search for the new big ism, the new big ideology, is this assumption that we will go through the anomaly, we will go through the crisis, and we will come out the other side into some new kind of normal. And it's very difficult to think about ideologies in ways that doesn't abide by that particular kind of rather tidy chronology. So I suppose the first thing I want to observe is that the limits of the ideas-based model, which posits this particular role for intellectuals, economists, and so on, all of that talk of post-neoliberalism and the Great Reset and so on, around about 2021-23, was elite rhetoric. Now, that doesn't mean that it was necessarily wrong, but I think we need to sort of think more carefully a bit about what's at stake when the likes of Janet Yellen or Rachel Reeves or anybody else starts to declare that they are now working within some new paradigm and start to think a bit more critically about some of the rhetoric that is at work there. One of the things that is also particularly awkward when thinking a bit about ideologies, political ideologies and their influence on political change is the role of what Alan Finlayson refers to as ideological online, so political entrepreneurs. The podcasters, the influencers, the various streamers, the people who are basically always online diffusing various ideas that do not pass through the circuits of credibility that one might hope, certainly people who work in universities. I'm just going to quote from some of Finlayson's work about this, because I think it gives us an idea of what is at stake when thinking a bit about the uncertainty right now. He says, digital ideological entrepreneurs do not need and make a virtue of lacking the imprimatur of the academic, journalistic or political professions. Their route to influence is not directly mediated by these institutions. They are not constrained by institutional or ethical rules or interests. Instead, they are governed by the economic and celebrity logics that drive social media to produce regular content, keeping up the outrage that attracts fickle audiences, to cultivate a consistent-seeming brand image, conforming to the need to imply authenticity and intimacy, and so on. So this also does quite a lot of violence to some of the assumptions regarding the ideas-based notion of a paradigm shift, or the notion of some of the kind of chronological model that derives from that kind of Kuhnian thinking. One of the things that I think is also quite awkward to grapple with, and this is something that I tried to grapple with in my book Nervous States that Nikolai mentioned, is some of the ways in which epistemological crises of economics that arise from alternative forms of representation, what we might call non-scholarly or non-theoretical forms of representation, or what some scholars, people like Nigel Thrift, I suppose, would call post-representational ways of engaging with the economy. And I suppose one way of thinking a bit about this is that capitalism, and this is where Thrift's work in his book Knowing Capitalism becomes relevant, is that capitalism constantly generates its own theories about itself that are not necessarily mediated via think tanks, universities, and so on. Various ways of capturing what's working and what's not, which don't require questions of, how they abide by various theories and so on. I mean, one of the big questions right now about Trump is, to what extent is the stock market sentiment worth paying attention to, and what extent are economic theories worth paying attention to? There is, economists are outraged by what they hear. I mean, in a sense, the just removal of trade barriers is the kind of central vocational normative purpose of economics as a discipline almost. And all of this talk of trade tariffs is generating lots of contradictory information at the moment. Now, of course, we're right in the middle of it, but there's a question there about the extent to which credentialed academic economics remains the most important means of representing what's going on, at least within the corridors of power. You could say that a kind of counter-argument to this would be that when Trump got in, of course, there was this document that's been analysed quite widely, which is the Project 2025, which was published by the Heritage Foundation, which was this whole blueprint for what to do. I think there's a couple of things about that which I think are sort of quite significant and quite different from, which are unusual when thinking a bit about the the role of ideology in driving political change. Firstly, that many of the chapters of that are not written by sort of intellectuals, as one might think, as they would appear within the study of intellectuals and the study of ideational political economy, but instead are published by various kind of practitioners and sympathetic business people, people from private equity, people from the financial world, also people who happen to work in the previous Trump administration. So these are kind of practitioners who are on board, who have got ideas about what to do, rather than people who are trying to come up with a new theory as to what's going on. The other thing which I suppose is kind of significant, and this has been discussed quite a lot in relation to what went wrong with the Biden campaign in 2024, is the disjuncture between economic sentiment and objective economic reality as processed by orthodox economic knowledge. And this was, a sort of way of showing how expectations, which had been running well above how, this was in a paper published by NBER, that expectations had been falling well below what economic indicators said was going on in the wake of the pandemic. And this, of course, has a disruptive political effect. This notion of vibes, and I come back to this question of the vibe shift, which you've probably heard lots of talk of vibes and vibe sessions and so on when trying to understand what happened in 2024. I suppose, again, one of the questions that needs to be raised about this is the extent to which standard economic indicators actually capture some of the most important social and psychological impacts of the economy. Of course, that can be fixed by getting better indicators and changing the sorts of indicators that are taken seriously. But this is one of the examples where I think it began to dawn on people, possibly too late, the difference, the disjuncture between what economists said was going on and what people felt was going on. And this is what happened with inflation in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. It topped there at about 9% in 2022. But this was what Bloomberg here calling it insult inflation, which was that the shock to food and fuel prices topped at 40%. And that was the highest it had been in 40 years. And obviously that does not, the fact that inflation falls back down again does not mean that all of those price rises are wiped out. And one of the things that I think still in the economic analysis of the US economy in relation to what's happened politically still doesn't get properly sort of discussed enough is the extent to which people, there's been all of this wage growth and there's been the inflation is over and so on, but prices remain wages remain in real terms lower as a result of the amount of inflation that took place in these particular areas. And obviously, you've probably seen when you break this down by different income group, it gets worse the lower down you go. The other thing which I think, which I've been interested in when trying to think about kind of the limits of economic theory when applied for the governance of economic policy, is this wider problem of statistical reasoning. Again, some of this I talk about in Nervous State. This is in the UK, this is the example that probably received the most attention in recent years, but recent months rather, is the response rate to the labour force survey. So you can see that over the course of about 20 years, the response rate dropped from around 70% to under 20%. Now this is obviously a huge problem for statisticians, and this is now bubbled up into a problem of governability. So again, there's exactly how this gets dealt with. What are the alternative data sources that would get used? But it represents a challenge to some of the kind of orthodox means of trying to govern economies, govern macroeconomies on the basis of conventional objective indicators. Just finally, I'm going to wrap up in a second. How are we doing for time? One of the things that I think when thinking about what kind of shift we have been witnessing then, and what kind of shift something like Trump represents, one way to approach this is to recognise that in actually applied to neoliberalism, particularly since the 1990s, there is this kind of paradox, which is that there is the replacement of one set of intellectuals and experts, which, as it occurred over the second half of the 20th century, was the replacement of planners, of socialist intellectuals, of certain traditions of social science, certain traditions of Keynesian macroeconomics, with a different set of technocrats, of managers, auditors, regulators, and consultants. I think one way of understanding what we're seeing at the moment, certainly on the right, is a radicalization of neoliberal rhetoric to turn some of the forces of capitalism and of neoliberalism against the very institutions and the technocrats which were established as being the guarantors of market liberty in the 1980s and 1990s. And that's where you see a lot of the rhetoric now coming not from, as I say, from conventional intellectual ideological sources, but instead a lot of rhetoric, some of which comes from think tanks on the right, but a lot of it coming from the sorts of political entrepreneurs that Finlayson talks about, the podcasters, the YouTubers, the influencers, some of it coming from libertarian intellectuals, but which have been dispersed via various online resources and so on. But most importantly, I think, being backed and pushed by the areas of finance that seek to benefit from political disruption. Certain entrepreneurs, but in particular areas of private equity, which has been so influential in backing the Trump administration, of particular forms of hedge fund capital that are so influential in supporting some right-wing intellectual policy movements, and targeting centres of technocracy as such. And I think one of the best books on this is this book, Out Finance, which the title doesn't really tell you what it's about. It says how the City of London bought democracy. It's actually an analysis of the Brexit referendum and of the funders of the two sides. And broadly speaking, to summarise the thesis, it argues, or it finds on the basis of studying of campaign finance, that the Remain campaign was backed by what they call Wave 1 finance, which broadly speaking is large institutionalised finance that benefits from a stable regulatory regime, open borders, the forms of technocratic achievement that were celebrated in the 1990s and since. Meanwhile, the Leave campaign was backed by what they call Wave 2 finance, which is finance that benefits from disruption, which is much more nimble, which doesn't necessarily seek to work with regulators, but instead to work against them, to find the cracks in regulatory regimes, and to exploit some of the upheaval of political change, and therefore becomes allied to political disruptors rather than suspicious of political disruptors. So you could say then that if what neoliberalism, in some of the earlier definitions that I was giving, its relationship to uncertainty was to minimize political uncertainty so that various private actors, entrepreneurs and financial markets can convert 19 uncertainty into normal uncertainty, that is to render the future calculable. Instead, what we're witnessing in certain areas, and I think this is what's unfolding in the United States, is, whether we call it a new neoliberalism or a form of post-neoliberalism, is a kind of political uncertainty that is amplified to generate more opportunities for well-connected entrepreneurs and financiers to profit. So one of the problems this poses for us is, and I think this is, partly to do with the rise of the political entrepreneurs and the crisis of the conventional static means of representing the economy, is how do we capture the role of these ideas and non-credentialed influencers when thinking a bit about how the economy is being governed and influenced, and the forms of it's not paradigms, it's the ideologies that are at work there. How do we capture the role of real-time data and sentiment in the representation and governance of capitalism? This is something that I think is something that was not simply, it was something that in a philosophical level, figures of economic thinkers such as Hayek and Keynes in the mid-20th century reflected on the curiosity that the economy is one of the strange areas of human life which is constantly generating representations of itself via the price mechanism in a way that is not true of other forms of social exchange. But now, as more and more forms of real-time data and sentiment and so on are generated, the question is, how does that fit into the regulation and the governance of capitalism? And I think one of the things that this is really a question, and I don't really know, I don't think anyone has got to the bottom of it, is what exactly do we make of the pandemic when thinking a bit about political and economic change and uncertainty? What are we to make sociologically, politically, culturally, psychologically of what took place over those 2 years? Because all sorts of different data points are emerging regarding reorientation of people's political sympathies, the amount of time that people spend alone, not just during those years, but since those years, the loss of certain forms of in-person socialization and how some of that has still not been repaired. Some of the implications of that culturally and politically, I think, are still very far from being properly understood. And I think that what happened in terms of the mainstream perception of that crisis in the work of people like Klaus Schwab talking about, the Great Reset and so on, was an assumption about what would happen to people's dissatisfaction with capitalism, which is very far from having been played out. So, as you can see, that's a rather disparate set of ideas and observations and questions for you, but hopefully that will generate some discussion. So thank you very much.
Fantastic, that's great, thank you so much. I'm going to start us off with a few questions. I really wanted to ask you about the critique of neoliberalism and the different ways in which the critique is framed. So, I don't think anybody in politics or otherwise would identify themselves as a neoliberal.
Yeah.
I think people both on the left and on the right have a critique of neoliberalism, but their critiques are very different and they're expressed in very different kinds of terms and categories, right? So people on the right, for example, like to talk about globalism and globalists. People on the left are more concerned about climate crisis, identity politics, all different kinds of inequalities and so on. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you see the relationship between these two kinds of critiques within the context of extreme political polarization. So is there any possibility for people with different political orientations who have a common enemy, as it were, is there any possibility for them to come together as they did? They sort of did that in the Occupy movement, didn't they? Or do you see them as kind of talking past one another and there being very sort of little possibility for a kind of united front? And even if there is some sort of coming together, what would that look like, and what would what would happen in the long run? Because these movements usually tend to sort of collapse and implode internally eventually.
So there are commonalities, because there are commonalities which say that this society is broken. This society cannot carry on like this. There is. I think, if people are doing social and cultural history in 50, 100 years' time, I think there would be a recognizable mood of pessimism that this thing that still runs should no longer be running. Now, that's a starting point. Obviously, that doesn't then lead to what you do about it. The next thing you would probably say is that there is a shared belief that I don't have much control over my life, and that democracy is, to some extent and in some way or other, a sham. This is obviously at a dangerous kind of set of sentiments, because you then go online and you go down a rabbit hole and you end up, believing that Bill Gates is trying to vaccinate you for some reason. but I think that these are in terms of affect and the sort of the affect of critique. These are things that these are very common, and these create a lot of confusion actually regarding left and right because of so I talked about that there is the conspiracy theory around the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum used to be the object, not of conspiracy theory necessarily, but it was a totem of a disconnected, anti-democratic global elite that the left fixated on for some time, and now it's the focus of a conspiracy theory on the right. So these are things that I think are central to this. I think that, if you read Naomi Klein's Doppelganger, which is a very, very good book about exactly this, she talks about how, in online spaces in particular, things get very, very confusing regarding how anti-capitalism, or anti-neoliberalism can start to, the left and the right get all sorts of, get very muddled up. And, the critique of, say, big tech and big pharma, which historically have been from the left, have now been picked up by elements of the right. Now, obviously, big tech is in a slightly different position in relation to this American administration. But and I think that so that sort of anti-corporate kind of sentiment is clearly something that straddles the two. I mean, yeah.
So I want to, I suppose, follow up on the same thing, but with reference to something you mentioned about intellectuals, and I think you referred to the narcissism of intellectuals. So what is the role of intellectuals in this critique? And is it possible to not be a narcissistic intellectual simply because of the structures of the platforms which people have as intellectuals in order to get that critique out there? I mean, if you're, if you're an academic, you are expected to, I suppose, hit certain kinds of metrics. You're expected to promote yourself in a particular kind of way. Even to be able to get into academia, you probably have to go through quite a few sort of sets of engagement practices that are based on a very kind of neoliberal framework of clicks and likes and retweets and so on. And even if you look at the kinds of critique that is being put out there in blogs and articles and so on, a lot of it is done in order to stimulate a particular kind of affect that reinforces people's already existing beliefs, rather than having an intellectual conversation in good faith, which is a very new liberal kind of thing, because that generates clicks and likes and so on and so forth. So what is the role of intellectual work in all this, I suppose, and what are the spaces where genuine intellectual work can be taken seriously and have an impact? In this critical
it's an interesting question. I mean, and the other thing is, there's you look at big non-fiction publishing as well. I was just in Waterstones earlier, and you get the sort of the big ideas table, which is full of all this stuff about how to save everything, and it's sort of and that's because that's the this stuff is there's now the sort of the circuit of that kind of thing of TED Talks and so on, which keeps that going. I mean, I suppose one of the things that you're right, and there is, I suppose, we all have there's a charisma of the big intellectual, the Milton Friedman type figure who's going to come along and say, stop doing it all like that, start doing it all like that, and then the problem will go away. There's a certain sort of, as I say, a sort of charismatic authority to that. I think that what tends to get lost in all of that is technique, really, and the ways in which some of the alternative systems of economic governance and so on actually work. I mean, there is a sort of a real dearth of good case studies of alternative what Eric Olin Wright called the real utopias of different forms of management and so on. And I mean, the things like what would be the case studies that would be taught in a business school for an alternative economic system? How would what sorts of technical apparatuses would be involved? You probably see more of that in something like the Project 2025 document than you do in most think tank outputs. It's not primarily interested in big normative ideas. It's actually a kind of blueprint for doing certain things. Now, obviously, you can have a sort of a narcissism of engineers rather than a narcissism of intellectuals. But I do think that one of the things that, in terms of back to what I was saying about the fascination with the neoliberal intellectuals, which I share, I've written about this and so on, but was this idea which began with Keynes during World War II, that the world can be sort of imagined into being by particular kind of gurus or something like that. And I think that the case of the 1970s and 1980s gave further momentum to some of that. But you're right about the structures of the incentives and the structures of intellectual production are an interesting component of this.
Great, thanks. Okay, we're going to open up the floor to questions. There is a question back there, Kathleen.
Hi, thank you so much for your interesting talk. Actually, I have a question regarding this paradigm shift that you mentioned. I'm confused about whether this is a paradigm shift that we should take, or there is really a paradigm shift that is taking place now. By that, I mean that, okay, if there is are we going towards a post-neoliberal paradigm? And if this is the case, you mentioned that the paradigm shift means that people try or start seeing the world differently. So if there is this paradigm shift, or we are moving towards a new, post-neoliberal paradigm, is there any change in how the economy should be run, or because as you said, of course there are some changes in politics, in social media, and the influencers, and replacement of the intellectuals, the traditional intellectuals with the new sort of intellectuals, influencers, and so on and so forth. I agree, but how about the economy that is at the core of the neoliberalism, and how about politics? So we know that political leaders are now, that they try to play a new role in the economy. But is there any change in our mindset about how the economy should be run, or is there just another version of neoliberalism that is probably wider than the previous one?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'm sure that there are lots of ideas out. There are lots of ideas out there, and I'm sure there are people here who have probably got lots of good ideas about what a different paradigm might look like. And there are ideas around degrowth and so on. I think the question which I was, I suppose, hovering around was, at the moment when there was most excitement around a paradigm shift, which was the early years of the Biden administration, it in some sense seems to have been a kind of a false start. Well, maybe not a false start, but it was willed into being in ways that didn't actually connect, perhaps, with a lot of people's experiences of what was going on with the economy. So there was a lot of this kind of elite level talk of we're going to have a new ism and so on. I think it was, and there was no doubt, to go back to the economically viable, technically viable, and politically viable, there was a set of interests that connected with it in a political sense. But the extent to which it kind of fixed the sort of wider social crisis that people might feel, or the whatever the sort of roots of the wider pessimism, it didn't appear to do that. I mean, I think I'm not quite sure whether your question is, about normatively, can I point towards a sort of different, better paradigm, or is it about, empirically, is there a different paradigm out there? Is it more the former or the second?
My question was that, are you talking about the should be?
The should be, okay. No, I was talking about, I was giving a sort of, I was giving a reflection on recent historical changes and some of the ideas that were involved in them. I think that we're not short of normative critiques of inequality, of oligarchy, of the extraction from nature and so on. And I know there are people who are piecing all of that together to try and offer a different paradigm, and it's commendable. I don't. Unfortunately, at the moment, if you look at what's going on in the UK at the moment, there was a seizure of a new paradigm, but which right now seems to be turning into, an attempt to reduce regulation and to open up access to green space for construction and infrastructure and so on. So in that sense, it's a sort of in some respects, a restoration of certain kind of neoliberal ideals to some extent.
So we have Sundas over there, and then over here.
My question is
I think, sorry, I think you need a mic.
My question is around a very specific bullet point I saw in the presentation, and that was how the private equity are essentially playing a very critical role around the lobbying
Yeah.
and the Trumpian presidency. Isn't that quite similar to what happened with the financial liberalization in the 90s? And the way to correct that was regulation.
Yeah.
And then so can we not use that as an example case study, whatever you want to call it, to correct this wave of craziness, I guess? Yeah.
No, sure. I mean, but that requires, obviously, no, absolutely. And that requires some political will. I mean, I'm just talking about, there is particularly in the United States, you can understand some of what goes on in terms of economic policy, in terms of who has bought that economic policy. And obviously you're not going to see that regulation come in the immediate future. Are you talking about in a place like the UK, for instance?
Well, actually, I did have a second question.
Yeah, go.
I'm not going to ask that. But the second question was, who do you see in terms of global powers actually perpetuating this to the degree that it is? So I wonder if the shift needs to start from the US, because you have players like Elon Musk, and there's a reason why he is there, and why we don't have anybody in the UK following something similar, because we don't have anybody like Elon Musk.
Right.
That's a very different conversation in itself.
Yeah.
So the question really was to understand, how do you correct these players that are essentially unregulated, which is following what happened in the 90s and what we went through with the crises, and whether something similar like that would happen,
Yeah.
that we can predict, and then therefore have a theoretical solution.
No, for sure. I mean, these forms of highly disruptive and often quite exploitative forms of financial capital, rely on not being regulated in certain ways for their profits. So yes, regulation of them reduces their disruption and their exploitation, for sure. I mean, I can't see that. I mean, again, you look at the UK at the moment, the financial regulation is now being rethought all around the pursuit of growth, and trying to trying to divert attention away from concern with broader systemic risk. So that's also not going in quite the direction that you're describing. But certainly, I mean, that's with the right people in place, that would be part of the solution.
Thanks so much. I'll declare my bias up front. My PhD research was on Kuhn and paradigms.
Okay.
So, but interested in kind of the larger explanatory framework. And I think one of the things for me that with the paradigm shifts, if using Kuhn as a kind of a model, is the question of where, at what level is the paradigm and its crisis coming in? What are the questions? And it seems to me that we're talking about this kind of interplay between politics and economics and what you could broadly call liberal capitalism in its broadest sense. And then we can argue about the flavors of it. But I think one of the things that I'm kind of interested in, that you kind of kept touching on, was this notion that there is a dissatisfaction with a current order, whether that's neoliberalism or more broadly capitalism and liberal democracy. I think that's where we can start to look at, and you start to see if it's at that level of this kind of, let's see, democratic capitalism, then people like Trump, people like Extinction Rebellion, all of these people, the Great Resignation, all become the signs of that dissatisfaction, and now people are starting to ferment new ideas of, well, what would this thing look like?
Yeah. No, that's interesting, and I think from what I understand from what you're saying, that doesn't then, that doesn't necessarily abide by the sort of paradigmatic kind of movement.
Well, it does, and
Right.
I think it's very much so.
But not in the sense of scientists or experts being integral to it.
No, but I think what it does say is that, in a very broad sense, Kuhn says that there's a community of practice, right? And so we say, we as the people here have this community of practice of economy, of politics, and we're trained. We have an ideal. We have a framework that is how we look at the world, how we operate in the world. We are educated in that. We have our experts and so forth and so on. That is what's in crisis, because it's not answering the real questions that people are living and experiencing right now. Is climate, the end of the promise of ever-growing economic wealth, etc.
Yeah, sure.
And so now it becomes, this is the crisis, and my hypothesis is probably that it's a bit larger scale than 5-10 years than 20 years we're looking at.
No, I think I buy that. I mean, I think that in terms of the focus, to narrow things back down to this question of neoliberalism and policy paradigms, I mean, one of the things that is relevant here, I think, is that if you think about a kind of clear anomaly, in the sense that stagflation was the anomaly in the 1970s, the anomaly was the collapse of the financial system in 2007, 8, 9. And there's but the question is, why was that not really allowed to become a crisis in the sense of a change of direction? And one of the reasons was that it was, obviously we know that the bailouts basically kept the show on the road, but it was treated like an emergency rather than a crisis, in the sense that it was something that had to be kind of shored up by any means possible. And that means that the wake of that, since 2010 broadly, means that something which, in some sense, the failure was kind of covered up, basically. And I think that partly accounts for the wider malaise and the ennui that you're describing. I mean, obviously not entirely, because when you think about things like climate and so on, then obviously that's it's not just related to sort of economy in that narrow sense. But I think you're right. I mean, I think that it's but this is, again, that when you think about that as a wider sense of ennui and malaise and a sense of pessimism, which of course is manifested in things like the inability of younger generations to achieve the same levels of prosperity of their parents and so on, the return of oligarchy, the return of massive return of inherited wealth that we're already witnessing, and will only get worse in terms of its kind of effect on meritocracy. The whole system starts to feel normatively kind of broken, basically. So I agree with that. I think that that doesn't lend itself to this same kind of, and I agree that it's not something which happens in 5 or 10 years. And that again is why, the model from the 1970s doesn't really kind of speak to the present in that sense.
Great, thanks. Yuan.
I think my question is more empirical, but it relates to the broader question of the relevance of the intellectuals today. Because as a young lecturer here at IGP, my teaching experience is like, not including my TA experience, my formal teaching experience is like about 5 years. And I would like to know from an experienced lecturer or professor's perspective, have you witnessed in terms of your intellectual conversation with students? Obviously, students who are able to come to a top university like London are really privileged if you look at them worldwide. Do you still, reflecting upon your teaching experience, do you feel there is a change of interest in a kind of conversation, in a kind of depth of communication that you're able to conduct with students in class regarding the intellectual conversation? Because what I'm feeling nowadays is that, for example, the recent rise of the right-wing, extreme far-right, I'm talking about extreme far-right in South Korea, are the young men in their 20s and 30s. They become very fast radicalized, but these are usually university students. They get the proper education, but they become radicalized because they are very influenced by the YouTubers online, and very often the conspiracy theories, if a lie is repeated again, and also sometimes promoted them by the algorithm of the social media platform that they use, it becomes kind of reality. They believe in it. And the ability for intellectual intervention of these young people is getting diminished. For example, it's hard to attract students to intellectual conversations like this nowadays. It's hard to engage students in class discussions nowadays. It's hard to get students to read material nowadays. I'm just not confident about the relevance of intellectual discussion, and back to Nikolai's question earlier about where intellectual conversations can happen. And I wonder, in your classroom, if you look back... I
don't really want to talk about my personal experience particularly. I think partly because I'm at a university the honest answer to your question is that I'm in a very different kind of university from UCL, and sadly, let's have a look at the league tables, and you'll see what I mean by that. I think that there's definitely something which is about the nature of reading and writing, which is clearly undergoing change, and we know this from there's a wider sense that there is a crisis of literacy in the traditional sense. For instance, many of us would have had the experience of teaching or learning during the closure of campuses due to lockdown. This is why the sort of thing I think we need to sort of think a bit about what happened during that period. There was talk of students who preferred that learning experience because they didn't have to leave their bedrooms and they could actually watch the video on double speed so as to basically get the lecture out of the way quicker. This was a phenomenon that was reported around the world. In the sense that the purpose of the learning experience is simply to try and get the information as quickly as possible and then get it back out into an essay as efficiently as possible. And when understood like that, whether or not ChatGPT is involved, ChatGPT is simply just kind of like, it's just doing what is already, it's like AI is sort of automating something that you've already kind of like given up before AI even came along, if that's what, one of the things that makes me feel sad, let's say, but is students who basically want to know what is the correct way to write this essay with every single, each bit. Tell me, and of course, ChatGPT, you can AI is amenable to that approach to sort of trying to get everything in the right order. But that didn't start with ChatGPT. That started with an approach to pedagogy in schools that are being heavily regulated and audited and scored and league tabled and so on, with amazing results. The results speak for themselves, but the results are just more scores. And these are, people who come through, I'm talking about mainly the UK education system, getting far better A-levels and GCSEs than they would have done from the same background 30 years earlier, but with this extremely rote So the point is that it's automatable in the sense it's a version of literacy and pedagogy that already lends itself to being automated in a way that, you know, so I don't, in some ways AI and plagiarism, I mean, I used to do plagiarism investigations for my department, and sometimes I really felt that the question of plagiarism almost just felt like a sort of weird academic hang-up in some way, you know, sort of like, but I wrote about this in the London Review of Books. My reflection on this was that, you know, it's almost like, well, if this piece of writing is really, really good, I mean, not that any student ever said this to me, but there's a sort of slight sense of like, you know, do you want me to just like rearrange the words and something? You know, what do you want exactly? And so there's a sort of, I feel like that is there's a wider crisis of pedagogy and literacy there. In terms of the young men, I mean, I see these surveys showing that, you know, young men in Europe are now, you know, far more within their, I think it's called their menu that they would consider for voting. The far right has been absolutely going like this amongst men in their 20s over the last 15 years. And that's happening in the UK as well. It's just that a lot of young people tend not to vote in very high numbers in the UK, and that's one of the reasons why it's not yet more of a problem in this country, I think.
Any other questions? Maybe I'll hang on. Let me see how much time we have.
We have a couple of minutes.
Okay, we don't have time. Maybe I'll just make a sort of quick remark and slash question and sort of see what you think about this. So with regard to the first question by Fatima about, you know, people changing their minds, I think that one of the big sort of cultural changes in the past decade or so has been that people take the climate crisis much more seriously. There's a lot of backlash, of course. There has been a lot of talk about how there's still an obsession with growth, but more and more people are aware of the issues and are willing to have discussions about the issues. So for example, you know, working at IGP for the past 10 years. 10 years ago, it used to be, oh, you work on prosperity, what is that? Now, more and more, it's sort of like, oh, you work on prosperity, do you mean as in the critique of GDP?
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what I mean. So there's a bit more of an awareness, and I think the debates have sort of caught on. So I wonder whether you think that might be a kind of leeway into bigger cultural changes, and economic changes in the next 10 years.
I do. I mean, I think that's clear, and I do think, I mean, we shouldn't just be too, you know, obviously there's been a lot of pessimism at the moment, and I think that you're right. I think it's quite, what is worrying at the moment is that the absence of growth in this country has now become the central political sort of critique of the political problem, and that we'll do anything for growth, which is like, we'll build more runways,